Hallo. We are entering a German episode today.
Yeah.
I'm not sure what German is, or what school is in German. You got any idea?
No, I actually don't.
Me either. Maybe German listener.
Studentag?
Something like clogs. I don't know. But yeah, we're headed to Germany this week.
We're heading back to Germany this week.
True.
Let's be honest, we spend a lot of time in Germany. A lot of shit happened in Germany. Crazily enough, when you pitched me the idea for this, you were kind of looking up like oldest car companies and everything, and little did we know, we stumbled into essentially what is the Wright brothers of modern automotive. Just, what's the term? Not automation, like
I don't know.
I'm lost on this word, but basically the modern way cars are presented, like what we think of when we think of a car, that's what was invented in Germany. And Mercedes Benz wasn't always Mercedes Benz. It took a while for that to actually come together. It took multiple, we're going to be talking about a tale of two men, kind of different guys with the same passion. And yeah, just being able to go back and actually pinpoint, would this be something that we actually looked into? Like if we just did this topic, it was interesting as it was, but then would we have to revisit like the invention of the automobile, or did we just stumble ass backward into this?
You want to know how we did it? Do you guys want to know how the sausage was made for this episode? The sausage was made for this episode because we fell into the Nazi trap, and then after we fell into the Nazi trap, we fell into the first automobile trap, just ass backwards.
And then the first automobile actually even ties into Nazis.
Yeah, it all comes. It's
got
horseshoe
everything.
theory.
Yeah.
Horseshoe theory completely.
Yeah, it's got everything.
So that brilliant man, and this is a little dated, but kind of forgot to do the intro last week. I'm sure somebody caught it and is like, okay, thank God they're doing it this week. That gentleman that just so astutely explained this over there is the Misty May to my Kerry Walsh. He's the Simone Biles to my Suni Lee. And he's the Michael Phelps to my Caleb Dressel. It's Professor Chris.
Not Ryan Lochte?
No. Well, I don't know. Maybe him and I have more in common than me and Caleb Dressel.
What's up, everybody? Yeah, if for anybody that's clicked on this, I'm trying to figure out a title because I think if we just do like Mercedes Benz, I feel like I have to do like Mercedes Benz origin of the modern automobile or something like that, because that's what this is. And the fact that this, not only is this company still around, it's still thriving. It's, we got G-Wagons, we got the F1 team, Mercedes-Benz kind of, now it's not quite the pinnacle of luxury or anything like that, but for a long time, that was the cream of the crop. And to find out how that started, not just making cars, but essentially the invention of the actual engine, and then how that turned into creating an automobile, and then how that ended up being co-opted during the Nazi period of Germany and turned into essentially a war machine. There's a lot of meat on this bone.
For the longest time, probably from like the maybe mid to late 90s all the way up till now, probably the most referenced car in rap music, I would assume, would have to be a Benz.
Oh yeah, they got the G-Wagon.
G-Wagon, Maybach, Beamer, Benz, or Bentley. I mean, it's just, I guess there's two other ones, or well, there are. Yeah, there's two others in there, but
speaking about other, auto manufacturers that are extremely well known, so many of these guys not only came out of Germany, but actually all kind of designed together and worked together at one point.
And then, as brilliant minds, they separated to go do their own thing because they felt they could do it better.
There was creative differences. Before we get into it, guys, remember, rate, review, subscribe, keep with the interaction. It's been awesome hearing from you guys. You got anything?
We love it. We love the interaction. Hopefully, as you're interacting with us, you're sharing the podcast too. It would be a great favor to us. And we love new listeners. This is bad. Somebody posted on, I believe it was Spotify. Trying to fill while I look this up. This shit was so cool.
The dude from Scotland?
That guy, very cool. Shout out to the Black Watch Sergeant. that hit us up on Spotify. No, where was it? Oh, YouTube. Stall a little bit till I pull this up. This was something very cool that hit close to home in the feels, just because this is kind of a way that Chris and I have kind of broadened out our friendship. Joshua Warden 3788 said, "You guys are the best. I've always been a massive history buff, but one of my best friends could never get into history like I did. When I showed him your podcast, he fell in love. Thank you guys for all that you do." That's kind of how this thing with Chris and I started. I mean, we both had different varying degrees of interest as far as history goes. And through each one of these episodes, when it's something that he chooses, like war or anything like that that I didn't know about.
Thanks for pigeonholing me on that, by the way.
Something like
I'm
war.
not gonna, no, it's 100% true.
But it brings me into that realm of like, this shit is so cool and I understand. And I hope it does the same thing for Chris. Like, this is why we do the podcast. So you guys can share this stuff with friends and you guys can bond like we do.
Oh, yeah, definitely. All right, guys, without making you wait any longer, we're getting into Mercedes Benz. Buddy, who are these two gentlemen we're going to be starting with today?
We abandoned the accent pretty quickly, and I feel like it's going to flare up every once in a while in this. But Carl Benz, Carl with a C, which traditionally doesn't always feel super German, was born November 25th, 1844 in Mühlberg, Germany, to Johann and Josephine Benz.
Okay, make sure you guys understood that. 1844.
Yeah, long time ago. Yeah. Carl's father died when he was 2 years old, so he didn't really get to know him. He was a steam engine conductor. I don't think he died in something steam engine related.
No, it was a heart-related thing, I think. Yeah.
So once his father went, his mother, they didn't make a lot of money before, but now it's just his mother trying to make sure that he can get the best education that he can. She pushed him. He answered the call and was very good in school, got a great education. He ended up getting accepted to this place called Karlsruhe, polytechnical school that was, it must have been close to their town or in their town where they had moved to.
Do you think they were called polytech schools, like polytechnical, or do you think that's something that we've
a modern adaptation to
a
what
modern
it was?
titling that we put on them to make them comparable to what we have today?
Maybe,
because that just seems like such a weird term. Like, where did you go? Yeah, I'm going to the polytechnic school. Yeah.
Well, I imagine it's like just the word polytechnical, instead of just a singular technical school, it taught many different technical subjects.
Yeah, that's true.
So it wasn't like going to electrician school. They had electrician school, plumbing school. I don't think those are polytechnic things, but like just they were sandwiched into one building, and it was one institution. He started out, I think it was like he was working on locks. Like he wanted to be a
locksmith.
Yes. Which seems like an odd place to start, but it kind of gets interesting just where this all ends up. He decided after a year or so, though, that mechanical engineering was the way that he wanted to go. He studied under this guy named Ferdinand Redenbacher. And
no relation to Orville.
Yeah, maybe. We don't know. I don't know where Orville's from. But this is sort of like, who was the guy that Darwin went and saw at the school that he walked with? The man that, or the boy that walks with...
Yeah, the guy that walks with Henslow?
Yes, yeah. That's it. This was sort of his Henslow. Redenbacher had a belief that internal combustion engines were going to end up making steam engines obsolete.
This is the wave of the future. Much like people thought Zeppelins were going to be except the gas engine actually did work out.
Yeah. But this belief that Ferdinand instilled into Carl at this age at this school was just like, an internal combustion engine is where the world is going. Carl answers that by saying, okay, well, that's something that I need to kind of still suss out, because if this is what he's saying and he's right, I can do things that people have never even thought of before.
So to provide a little bit of context, so we were talking about this before the show. So everything at this point is steam powered. So we've talked about
Or
when did we
horse.
talk when did we talk about steam power? We tied it into something we
Scotland,
did a few weeks
right?
ago. Huh?
Was it Scotland and the steam engines?
Oh yeah. It was James Watt. So with steam power, essentially and it also Chernobyl. That's where
Yes.
it came in. That nuclear reactors are essentially just steam engines, is what they are.
And bombs.
So steam engines, essentially, you would create enough heat to then vaporize water, a water source. The steam would not expand, not contract. It would expand and fill a larger space, so you get more pressure. The pressure would then be used to push a piston. The piston would be used to turn a crank, and then in turn that could be used to turn a wheel, the power stiff. So an internal combustion engine, instead of using fire and water to create steam, you're essentially creating a controlled explosion. So in your normal internal combustion engine, lawnmower, your car, whatnot, basically you have your piston. Your piston has a chamber in which it moves up and down to turn the crankshaft. And to power that piston moving up and down, fuel and air are pumped into the chamber. It's ignited by the spark plug. And then the exhaust is then released out another section of the chamber. And that's what comes out your tailpipe. The process repeats itself over and over extremely fast. And that's how an internal combustion engine works. You're basically, at this point, you're just trying to harness an explosion. That's what they determine now is going to be the wave of the future. It's like, hey, this steam thing is going out of fashion. Explosions are going to be the way that shit's going to get moved around in the future.
They saw the power of an explosion and thought, well, this provides more push and steam.
Think of it this way, too. The amount that a steam engine could provide would be based upon the amount of steam it could produce within the pressurized chamber. To get more power, you would have to create larger and larger chambers and, heat those. With an internal combustion engine, you simply are creating a small version of that. And yeah, you have to make larger cylinders to get more power, but just from a comparison size, it's much, much more compact because you're able to generate more power with each of those combustions.
Yeah.
And so that definitely makes sense what Bridenbacher is saying, that of course it's going to be the wave of the future if they can find a way to make it reliable and control it. It probably seemed like a pipe dream at that point as well, because anytime someone is trying to kind of not really change the status quo, but have a far-reaching idea to try to modernize or advance something, people are like, that'll never, what, you're using gas, alcohol to try to make power? Like, how does that work?
Where's the firebox on this thing?
Yeah.
Because that's really what it comes down to. If you can create an internal combustion engine, it's going to be more compact, so it can go in different things. You don't have to continuously feed a firebox with wood or coal, which I just looked it up because I thought maybe there was a chance that there was like a gas-powered steam engine, like that gas created the fire that then boiled the water.
So basically, like you're boiling water on your stove?
Yep, on a gas stove. Couldn't find anything on it, but it's holding its own fuel source and it's providing its own charge for that power, whereas you have to continue to feed a steam engine.
You're not turning around with a coal shovel, dumping
The
shit in the back of your car.
Yeah, so I mean, it's very clear that this would have been the way of the future if they could harness it. He ended up moving from Mannheim, which must have been where Karlsruhe was. And this was after he graduated July 9th, 1864. So that would have made him 19 years old. I think he started at the Polytechnic School when he was like 15.
Yeah.
So
He
again,
took the
I don't
entrance
know
exam when he was 15.
how German school works over there, but
One thing about the stories like this of the origination of these types of things, like the engine, the automobile, flight with the Wright brothers, other people would have probably figured this out. These types of things are the race to who's going to figure it out first. And the distance between them could have been years that someone would have figured this out. It could have been 2 months. The Wright brothers, if they hadn't have figured it out, it could have been 10 years or 20 years. We would have been that much further behind in the advancement of flight with these engines, because this was something that was being worked on in several different locations, and that's what's really going to play into this story. It's just almost kind of a race to see who's going to be able to provide the best application of it, who's going to come up with the biggest idea that's going to help the most people or convenience the most people.
and I don't know how much they knew about what everybody else was doing. Like, we're going to talk about a guy, Nicholas Otto, coming up that kind of, I think, everybody knew about. But there's no way that Benz knew about other guys that were building other engines.
No, because the other guy we're going to talk about lived literally 60 miles away and was doing the exact same thing without any interaction or knowledge of each other.
Yeah, this is kind of like when we try to figure out how civilizations, like, came along the same evolutionary markers.
Yep.
Like fire and all that shit. Like, it wasn't a worldwide
Irrigation,
thing. Slowly
rerouting
figured
of
it
water,
out.
stuff like
exactly.
that. So Ben's kind of goes and is kind of a journeyman in like other professions. So for 7 years, he gets professional training in all of these other fields. Not really sure if it was by choice. I think he got bored a lot of what he was doing, and he ends up being, he's always been a creative guy. He's in situations where he doesn't really get to use that creativity. He ends up being a draftsman, which is the guy that actually draws out everything for making scales. He works for a bridge building company. At one point, he works for an iron, foundry. And so he's not really sure where he's getting the experience that he's going to apply later. But I do assume that working in these other jobs, he's got to be picking up little things, even if it's metallurgy or ways in which different materials can actually like bind to each other to create a small engine block or a manifold or something.
Well, I think he had an idea once he worked in the foundry, kind of that would be a business that was sort of a failsafe. Because when he moved to Mannheim, he met a guy named August Ritter. And they opened up their first shop together that was a mechanical workshop, but also it was an iron foundry. And this was at age 27 in 1871. Mm-hmm. So I think his prior knowledge of like an iron foundry will always have business.
Yeah, it was they opened a sheet metal working factory, I think is what it was.
I thought it was a foundry. Maybe it was a sheet metal factory.
It could be both. You could be producing essentially the sheet metal and you're having to melt it down and pour it into molds and stuff. I think it's maybe one and the same.
Yeah, I mean, they knew that they kind of had to have something that would bring in money. And then the mechanical workshop was definitely for like Benz's mind.
Yeah.
He needed somewhere to tinker, he needed somewhere to work. Mm-hmm. And so the mechanical workshop maybe was the passion for it, but they needed a way to make money.
So you're saying that for Benz, it's kind of like this podcast is for us. We have our stuff that has to bring in the money.
Yep.
But then we also have this passion project that we're hoping can turn into something else. We're fucking pioneers, man.
Yeah, we're not German, but maybe we're on the same trajectory. I'd like to think we are. But the issue was they were not making any money. The other issue was he probably didn't know Ritter very well because he kind of turned out to be a dud and unreliable. He wasn't making payments on things, and eventually all of their tools got repossessed.
Reminds me of that scene at the very beginning of Grandma's Boy, where he's giving his roommate the money for the rent, and he's been spending it on Filipino hookers, so they end up getting kicked out. I feel like he's been putting Ritter in charge of like the books, and he's like, "Hey, we keep getting these past due notices and everything." He's like, "Yeah, don't worry about it."
You're always so energetic, but we don't seem to have any money coming in. Not spending it on cocaine.
Yep, not at all.
Not doing that. Luckily for Benz, he actually got involved with a wealthy girl named Bertha Ringer. Bertha's a tough name for anybody, but Bertha is a badass in this story. Bertha came from a pretty well-to-do family, and once things got serious enough and they knew that Ritter was screwing over the business, they needed to get their tools back. They actually got an advance from Bertha's father, who wasn't a big fan of Carl. She was wealthy. He was a peasant. It's a story as old as time. Love stories always get this cheesy spin.
We're Lady in the Tramp situation we got going on here.
Yeah, pretty much.
Except this tramp is a mechanical engineering genius.
Or Titanic. I mean, literally, you can go across the board.
Real Rose Jack Dawson.
But they ended up getting an advance on the dowry that was to be paid to Carl for marrying Bertha.
Yeah, I don't know if that ended up turning into the dowry, is what it was. It came down to the marriage, and he's like, "Remember that money that you owe me? Why don't we just say we're square on that?"
Yeah, we're even. She used that money that she got fronted from her father to pay Ritter out to buy up all of his
shares or ownership stake or
whatever you want to call it. To the company, Ritter is out, they get the tools back, and then all of a sudden, Bertha and Benz both own this store, or both own this company. The pair ends up getting married July 20th, 1872, and they would go on to have 5 children. First, it was 3 in the first 5 years.
Yeah, Carl liked to get busy.
Which, to me,
Bertha liked to get down.
You have to do that knowing that Dad's rich, right? Because if you're trying to pursue your passion and you're
Grandpa's
poor,
rich.
or Grandpa, yeah,
Yeah.
you keep pumping out kids. Like he had his priorities.
Yeah, just tying those threads together. Getting Ritter out of there ended up being exactly what was needed. Benz kind of pivots a little bit and uses their factory to start pushing the development of his engines, and actually it ends up taking off.
Stationary engines.
Stationary engines, exactly. So at this point, the thought of having a mobile engine, there's not really an application. Like, why would you need a mobile engine? Maybe in a boat or something like that. But at the same time, engines are being used to power things in factories like cranes, conveyor belts, things like that. And so this is starting to pick up, and he creates this reliable 2-stroke engine. Now, we talked about this before the podcast. I'm going to try to explain it a little bit quicker.
Yeah, tell me about your stroke game.
Yeah, my stroke game. So the 2 types of engines are 2-stroke and 4-stroke engines. I'm sure there's more, but these are the ones we're talking about now. A 2-stroke engine basically is the number of strokes it takes to complete what's considered a power cycle. The power cycle involves essentially the firing of the flammable fuel or whatever it is, creating the thrust, the power to force the piston down to rotate the crankshaft.
The combustion.
So in a 2-stroke, the way that the engine and the way that it fires is set up is it goes up, traps the fuel, the spark plug ignites it, it pushes it down, and as it's coming back up, it's already discharged the exhaust and it's pumping in new fuel. So it only takes up and down. So 2 strokes, they count up and down, 1 stroke each. 4 strokes, which most modern vehicles are, your car, your truck, all that kind of stuff, you basically have your cylinder and you have your valves that bring in the fuel and you have your valves that have to take out the exhaust. So in that, it takes 4 strokes, 2 down and 2 up, in order to complete the entire process. You have to pump the fuel in. It then has to move up to compress the fuel, lights it with a spark plug, forces the piston down. But at this point, you have to get the exhaust out. So the next force of the piston coming up is to force the exhaust out the other valves. And then as it travels back down, that's when it pulls fuel in for the next round. So the simpler version is going to be the 2-stroke. And by creating essentially a reliable 2-stroke engine, he kind of corners the market on a market that is really just starting to take off.
We should have started with this fact. I think Chris and I are both car guys to the point that we have an appreciation for them.
Yes.
When we start talking about mechanical things and how it all happens, most of this stuff is freshly learned from this episode, for the most part. Like, I can kind of I completely understand how an engine works. There's still a little bit of magic sprinkled in there, just like flight, that I don't quite understand. Mm-hmm. But I couldn't take apart an engine and put it back together.
I might be able to do that if I have YouTube and instructions.
Yeah, but not on your own. Or to know why you did it.
The thing that, and I can understand why car people like gearheads that like to actually like work with the mechanical aspects of the engine, everything like that, can really get sucked into this. It's like fucking magic, or magic created essentially the thoughts that someone had in their head to even fathom how to construct something like this. When you really boil it down, this technology is so new at this time. Electricity, like harnessed electricity, is still not like a norm. It's kind of a luxury in some circumstances. And you're trying to create this device that also requires electricity for the spark to actually function. So it's not just having a mechanical know-how in metallurgy or how fuel combusts or anything. You have to be so smart in so many different disciplines in order to bring all of these things together. And maybe that's why things like this don't happen all the time, is you have to have someone whose mind understands it, and not only that, but has a drive and a passion to want to pursue that. You know, a lot of things have to align for something like this to happen.
Well, to think about it now compared to then, like now if your battery goes out, in order to start your car, you have to jump it.
Yeah.
prior to that, or if you have a manual, you could always jump start it by throwing it in first or running it in neutral, getting some speed, putting it in first, and trying to pop it in. These guys, I mean, I don't think any of these had batteries because they couldn't have alternators to use the battery power to recharge it.
Or not batteries in the way that we understand them
Uh-huh.
or anything like that. Did it have a self once the motor got going? Because you would have to crank start it. Once it got started, was it a self-perpetuating thing where it created its own electricity through some form of movement or inertia?
It's just so fascinating. So when we try to explain the technical stuff, if it sounds a little shaky, it's because it's not like...
It's because it is.
Yeah, it is shaky for
Yeah.
us, for sure.
Well, due to the popularity that these engines are starting to build, you go to a bank, and if you're trying to expand and everything, and someone looks at you and they're like, well, yeah, you're selling a lot of these things, but if this thing goes tits up, like, we're losing all of our money. We would like you to maybe have a little bit of... Let's diversify a little bit. Let's take on some partners, some people to share the load to make sure you have enough financial stability and you also have enough of a workforce to meet the, supply and the demand. He doesn't really want to do this because at that point, if he's taking on partners, he's actually having to give over some form of control.
He has to listen to somebody else.
Exactly. And at this point, what he's doing is working. But if he wants to grow, this is kind of the caveat. So he ends up finding these two brothers. One of them was a photographer and the other one was like a cheese salesman or something like that, cheese distributor.
I don't know what his brother did.
But finds these two brothers to end up taking them on as partners. And it doesn't take very long before exactly what he feared was going to happen ends up happening. Because when they do this merger, he ends up getting pushed out and only having like 5% of the control of or at least shares the ownership of the company.
Yeah, the whole thing gets very, very interesting in how that works. As far as that went, that ended up being, that actually ended up being, I believe, after he had created the engine.
Mm-hmm.
That's why he got his full patent on the engine. Sorry.
Oh, gotcha. Okay.
So he had created this patent on the engine, just like Chris was talking about. If you have like proprietary things that only you can do, the bank's going to look at that and be like, okay, well, if this ends up taking off, you have like a guaranteed revenue flow because everybody has to pay you to use your system.
Yeah.
If it works. Along with that, and going back a little bit before this, there's a guy that we talked about before. His name is Nicholas Otto. Nicholas Otto had patented the first four-stroke internal combustion engine in 1876. So this is 2 years prior. This four-stroke engine is all the rage now, but nobody can build it like he did because he has the patent on it. So you have to figure out a different way to do something in order to achieve the same thing. And this is where Benz comes up with this two-stroke engine idea. Because as Chris very explained to me and then explained to all you guys during the episode about the difference between a two and a four-stroke engine, it's almost like Benz had an engine, if he could do it in two strokes, that may be able to work the same way, but
smaller, simpler.
Yes.
Yeah.
So this is where the idea comes for the two-stroke engine. Right around this time as well, Nicholas Otto had a technical director that worked for him named Gottlieb Daimler, and he had the head of engine design, a guy named Wilhelm Maybach.
The name may sound familiar. Recently, there has been the newest, like, top-of-the-line luxury cars are Maybachs. So you're going to hear a lot of names for auto manufacturers that you're going to recognize. Just talking about the guys that are the design or technical guys or like engineers for these different companies that, like you said earlier, branch off to kind of do their own thing. So one of the first ones was this guy, Gottlieb Daimler. Daimler, however you pronounce it. I think over in the States it's more Daimler because when they say Daimler Chrysler, but it's Daimler. This guy is kind of a more serious version of Carl Benz that lived 60 miles from him that was doing the same thing that he was doing, trying to develop, the next big thing as far as engines go. Do you want to jump into and do you want to go Daimler now and kind of explain his upbringing, or do you want to wait till we're a little bit further into Benz?
Give us Daimler's upbringing.
Okay. So Gottlieb Wilhelm Daimler, March 17th, 1834. So he's 10 years older than Carl Benz. This guy invented the high-speed liquid petroleum fueled engine. So up to this point, it's not just like gas. Like they haven't figured out the refinement of oil, then diesel, then actually into like higher octane gasoline. So a lot of these things are running off like a mixture of almost like an alcohol and then like some type of petroleum mixed in with it.
Yeah.
So he's the first one to come up with the high-speed liquid petroleum fuel engine, which basically means he's able to go faster. He's able to have more applications for different things. Gottlieb had he wasn't pointed in the direction of making an automobile. Benz, that was kind of his secret thing, is he wanted to make the horseless carriage. And that was kind of why he was making these engines. And the engines were just kind of a means to an end. If he could make the money off the engines and then he could focus on his passion project, he could then combine the two and it would be perfect. Daimler was like, I want to make engines that power everything. I want to be the go-to guy for transportation. I want these things. I want to be air, sea, and land. So he ends up developing this. Going back a little bit, age 13, that's when he first becomes interested in engineering. He then kind of pivots, and by 18, he's like a professional gunsmith.
Pretty cool.
Like able to make his actual own guns. I think they said like the thing that he had to make in order to get his like certification to be an actual gunsmith, he actually made like 2 revolvers. Like created them.
That's pretty interesting.
Yeah. So after he masters, the gunsmith thing, he gets bored and he goes back into mechanical engineering. He works he goes to an industrial arts school, Polytechnical Institute, honing his skills, and then starts to work with steam locomotives. So he's trying to kind of get his feet wet, try to find out kind of how engines of the time are working and how to apply that. Ends up going to England for a spell to gain some knowledge about like machine tooling and everything, and ends up meeting the 15-year-old Wilhelm Maybach there. And I think when he met him, he was like in his like mid-30s, but basically meets this orphan kid. And I don't know if it's just he's just got such a keen mind or does something to impress him, but ends up being the golden goose that comes with him and kind of travels with him professionally throughout kind of his career.
They're a team.
Yeah.
They both, I think, had different strengths, whereas I think Daimler was a little bit more of, he was definitely interested in engines and all that, but he also knew how to promote what they were creating. Mm-hmm. And I think Maybach was just, his mind was just engines. I don't think he had a lot beyond that. His mind was, I think, very detailed, and that's where I think, like, they use the term Maybach now for, or not, they use the term, that's what they're called, just Maybach Benzes. The attention to detail and the fine luxury that a Maybach has, I think, comes from how he built an engine.
I think it was the combination of engine, and he had such an eye for the actual aesthetic design of it. Once they were able to get to a point, it's going to be a long time before this gets to be what we know as a modern automobile that's got like a shell and casing and stuff like that. It starts out very simple, but it's got to start somewhere. Once Maybach starts actually like designing and stuff, you start to see like the beautiful curves and angles and everything like that.
Yeah, so this is happening, what? You said 60 miles down the road?
Yeah.
That Daimler, who has very similar passions, it seems like, to Benz, but he hasn't pushed his mind far enough into the automobile. It's like, yeah, I'm going to build engines. I'm going to start building my own two-stroke. At the same time, Benz is building his two-stroke. And eventually, December 31st, 1879, Carl and Bertha successfully run Benz's two-stroke engine for the first time. Funny that it happens December 31st, right before the turn of a new decade.
Yeah.
But they do it. It happens. His full patent is granted June 28th, 1880. His next patents that he would cover, this list blew me away. The spark plug, the battery-powered ignition, the carburetor, the clutch, a speed regulation system, and a gear shift, and then a water radiator.
Yeah.
Like, he like, started with an engine, and then he patented everything else that you need an engine to run.
Exactly. So he was like, well, technically, you can configure this engine and the pistons and cylinders in a bunch of different ways, like a bunch of different configurations, and that will differentiate enough where someone could get a patent for, like, it's the difference between like a V8 and then you have like an inline six.
Yep.
Like, if you have a patent on an engine, it's not like you get both of those patents. You have a patent on a certain design of the engine. But what all engines need are going to be a cooling system. They're going to need spark plugs. They're going to need an ignition. They're going to need all the things that he was like, I don't have to corner the market on the engine itself. I'm just going to take the patent on everything that these things are going to need to run.
Yeah, I feel like we had, maybe it was the Wright episode that was kind of the same way with the patent and how it all worked. But as Chris was talking about earlier, once they still weren't making a whole hell of a lot of money and they needed money to expand, he was forced to find investors because his bank was going to require him to try to incorporate all of his IP, so all of his patents and everything. Mm-hmm. They wanted a chunk of that business. And Benson's like, no, I'm not going to give you guys my ideas. We're not going to bank on those ideas. Those are mine and mine alone. So in order to find money, he finds this gentleman, photographer named Emil Bueller. He would help financially back the business along with his, did you say, cheese salesman brother?
Cheesemonger brother.
His cheesemonger brother. The business became a joint stock company. It was named Gastromotrin Fabrik Mannheim, because they're in Mannheim. In 1882, just like Chris talked about, Benz ends up quitting the company later because the share dissolution, it got him down to like 5%. Mm-hmm. And once he was down to 5%, they just kind of started neglecting his ideas. They're like, yeah, dude, the engine thing's cool. I get it. It's fun. It's a fun project. You want to do this car thing, which is even crazier. We just want to continue doing what we're doing because that's the way we're going to make money. Yeah. Your car's never going to make money. Yeah, you're not going to create this thing.
Yeah, we're going to go ahead and keep manufacturing the engines that you design because that's where we're making the money, and you'll get your royalties and you'll get your, your patent and everything like that, or the funds that you get from your patent. He ends up just leaving the company and ends up going back and working at a bicycle like repair shop, which I don't know how this ties in with the Wright brothers, if there's something about pioneering forms of transportation and working in a bicycle shop. I don't know if you just get so tired of working on bicycles that you're like, I got to get these people traveling through some other means, so I stop having to work on so many fucking bicycles. But works there, ends up meeting two guys, and they end up forming another company. Now, this company is going to specialize in both making industrial machines for like factories, like stationary engines, but then also gas engines. And as they start to grow and everything, this company starts to take off as well. Kind of reminds me of Disney as well. Getting sold out of the first company. You made the reference, if this reminded me of that. Yeah, it's got a lot of similarities. And their company success ends up leading to Benz having enough financial stability and free time that he gets to now pivot back to his passion project. And he's like, this thing's running itself. It's a well-oiled machine. I like the guys that I'm working with. I don't feel like they're going to try to hose me. I'm going to go back to trying to make this car.
Well, and they just built everything so fast. They built this brand and company so fast. The two guys that own the bicycle repair shop, Max Rose and Friedrich Eblinger, something like that. The new company that was formed in 1883 was called Benz and CIE. I don't know if that's like company in German, I assume, just because like we get like, and co. Yeah, exactly. So you have this brand new company, and this brand new company is going to need to start doing what they needed to do. I want to say, just a sec, let me move this. I want to say it was like, they started producing these these industrial machines, these static engines.
So static means that they're stationary, correct? Yep. Okay.
So 25 employees. Excuse me, is what the company had. 25 employees building engines. I don't know how fast you're producing them, but they must have produced them pretty fast because, like you said, once they had all those employees, once the ground floor was taken care of for these industrial machines and these static engines, Carl sets out to achieve this goal of this internal combustion motor-powered carriage.
So we get to 1885. Now, the Benz Motorwagen featured a 4-stroke engine, very advanced coil ignition, evaporated cooling, and wire wheels. That was the most questionable part to me, is the wire wheels. Like, we're talking like the type of wheels you would see on what were the big penny bikes that we were talking about during the ride, the crazy like tiny back wheel and the
Hipster
big
bikes.
Yeah.
Well,
So
how many wheels though?
yes, because he was basically taking a Carriage, or no, I'm sorry, that was actually Gottlieb, that was Daimler. Because he was designing this all himself, he didn't just take a pre-existing Carriage and wasn't just like, oh, I'm going to strip everything out of it, use the frame, and then just basically put an engine in this thing. He kind of built it from the ground up, but built it as a tricycle
And he
or
sort
a
of
three-wheeler.
Yeah, he sort of built it around the engine.
Yes.
That was his starting point. And just like you were talking about when you said that, notice that you said a four-stroke engine.
Mm-hmm.
You know how he ended up being able to build a four-stroke engine?
He did get into some type of like, didn't he work with Otto?
Otto
at some
lost
point?
his patent.
Oh, that's right.
His patent was voided. So as soon as his patent was voided, it was a race to see who could create a four-stroke engine. And it just so happens that it happened at the right time, and he was able to put a four-stroke engine in this three-wheeled contraption.
Yeah, like Adam was saying, so basically that's the difference between Daimler's version and Benz's version is Benz basically built everything around the engine itself. So the engine sat between the two back wheels, and then the front wheel just basically had almost like just a stick for a steering wheel, and you would just rotate it right or left, and it would, you would turn. As he develops this, they don't unveil it publicly until the next year. So 1885, kind of toward the end of the year, is when he actually gets this thing built. They ended up unveiling it about 6 months later, July 3rd of 1886 in Mannheim, and put on a demonstration where this thing got up to 10 miles an hour. Now, of course, compared to any vehicles now, people can run faster than, track stars can run faster than 10 miles an hour. But at the same time, when you have this thing that is brand new technology, if you're going 10 miles an hour and you hit something stationary in a three-wheeled...
Hitting anything in a three-wheeler, if the one wheel's in front, you're getting dumped.
That's true. So these things were, and if you want to pull up pictures of it, the original, it's called the original Benz motor wagon. You'll see basically it looks very rickety. Does not look stable at all. But this thing was something people had never seen before.
Yeah.
Where's the horse? It's horseless, motherfucker.
He creates it in 1885. He patents it January 29th, 1886. As Chris was alluding to, this first demonstration went, I think, okay. Another demonstration that had happened after that went real south because it actually crashed into a wall. Mm-hmm. So 10 miles an hour, as Chris was talking about, crashing into a wall. Everybody that just watched that is probably going to be pretty horrified at what they just saw.
Here's the other thing, too, about this from the way I understand it, because the concept of a throttle doesn't really come into play at this point. You start the engine, and the engine isn't producing a ton of power. I think we looked it up. It's 0.75 horsepower was this first engine that he used in the first motor wagon. So you would have to, of course, be down on the ground. You would have to get the engine started, and I think you would just have a brake engaged, and there wasn't enough horsepower to actually move it unless the brake was released. And then you would just simply, the max speed that it would get you up to once it got enough speed, because I think it was running at just one consistent RPM.
It was chain driven. There was only one gear. Mm-hmm. So just like you were talking about being chain driven, there's no way to disengage the power. Yeah. It's just that the brake can stop it. And luckily it doesn't have enough horsepower to just force itself through the brake.
You could put a block under one of the wheels and it wouldn't have enough. That's the other thing too. It couldn't go up a hill or anything. So you put a block under one of the wheels and it's not going anywhere.
Exactly.
But still, there's nothing pulling this thing. It's moving on its own.
1888, we see after there were some modifications made, probably after the crash, public opinion was pretty shoddy on them. Mm-hmm. 1888, we see the modifications come in on the Motorwagen 2. The Motorwagen 2 was only around for a year because in 1889, the Motorwagen 3 was introduced at the Paris Expo in 1889. What else was introduced at the Paris Expo in 1889?
Eiffel Tower?
Yes. So in the same world exposition, we got the Eiffel Tower and we got like the first vehicle, the first motor car.
How did we not know about that on the World's Fair episode? Did the Eiffel Tower just completely overshadow that so much that
I think
the first automobile was just an afterthought?
Well, and at the same time, if the public was like, this isn't that great anyway, like, it is a very modern marvel.
Yeah.
But just like a lot of things, I think.
Bad.
Yeah, at the World Fair, it was kind of like, we have this technology, it's never going to go.
That's right. It's like the concept, but the concept is never going to be mass produced because, again, these weren't mass produced. This was like one of the only ones.
It's like that cigarette smoking robot we talked about.
That's right. The Model 3 had such crazy advances as wooden wheels. They finally just switched up and they're like, okay, we need to go with wooden wheels. In 1888, the year before that, that's when they actually started selling what would be recognized as the first commercially available automobile.
Pretty cool.
So they're mass producing these things, first commercially available automobile. Of course, only the rich people, richest people can afford these because they're a luxury item that essentially probably costs a lot to make. The version that they were selling had 2 gears, was not able to go up any inclines, and it didn't drum up a lot of, buzz and popularity. People kind of probably saw it as kind of a gimmick. It was slower. Maybe it took fuel, which people probably didn't know how to get access to. A horse, you knew what to feed it. And so it was one of those things that I think it was like when Teslas first came out, somebody got Tesla and was like, look how fucking cool is this? No one else has this shit.
Yeah.
And I think it was more of a flex than anything. But in order to basically get some eyes on this thing, I'm going to let you tell the story. But
You son of a bitch, you set this up perfectly with those.
But Bertha, being the bad bitch that she is, ends up taking it upon herself to promote the shit out of this thing, and I'm going to let you tell the story when we get back from a bathroom break.
Okay.
Well, hey there, all you sexy historians. How you guys doing?
It is time for
Socials.
Where can they find us on Instagram?
If they want to follow us, they can find us at Historically High Pod on Instagram.
That goes the same for Threads as well. You can also find us on Twitter.
Tell them about Twitter.
Historically High. That's Historically HI on Twitter.
And if you want to email any of your comments or suggestions, where can they find us at, Adam?
At Historically High Podcast at gmail.com.
Gmail. All right, and back to the show. All right, can I tell you something? I got a crush on Bertha.
A little bit. Besides the name, everything else seems like it was there. And from what I've heard, she's a looker. I haven't looked her up to see yet, but I feel like if this woman was this pretty and this much of just a genius, marketing-wise, and had the drive, she was kind of the yin to Carl's yang.
She would have been too powerful had she had a sexy name.
True. It had to be Bertha to slow her down.
She had to get brought back a peg or two by the name.
It was the only feminine stumbling block she seemed to have.
There you
go. But this story jacks me up because it is so cool. They were having a tough time selling because the market wasn't behind them. They were pretty skeptical of all this.
People also, when they saw like these things being tested, they saw them being driven around town and they would see the Benz go and get the groceries or something like that in it. But people were looking at this being like, but can you just drive it around the city? What can it do? Like, you're showing us little snippets, and what you're showing us can do, we can just walk there, or we can just ride a bike there, or take a horse there. Like, you're not showing us that this thing can do anything outside of what we already have that's going to make us want it. So she's like, I'm going to show you something then.
Yeah, without telling Carl, without really letting anybody know, besides maybe her mother, she sets off on the morning of August 5th, 1888. Bertha sets off with her 2 oldest sons in a Model 3 Motorwagen, and she sets out on this journey from Mannheim to Pforzheim, I think, probably silent P on that. It was a distance of 65 miles or 104 kilometers, and sounds like a hell of a long way to go in this thing. The tricky thing was, and this was something that I really hadn't thought about until I heard it, but all she had to drive on for quote-unquote roads were horse paths, carriage paths, and Roman roads.
Yeah, the ones with the stones and everything,
Yeah.
and they tried to fill it in.
So she's not driving on this luxurious road that's
There's no
completely
pavement.
flat.
Yeah, there's no pavement. This has ruts in it. This is just basically where horses are either towing carriages or just riding themselves. This is not a place. It's not within the city that's got some type of like cobblestones or something like that. This is out in the country.
It's just the toughest terrain to try to do this on, I think, besides just going completely off road. But nonetheless, her and her sons both start out with her at dawn, and this journey that she takes was just proof of the benefit of a vehicle. She ends up making the trip in 12 hours, spends 2 days there, and comes back. This trip just seemed like it was her figuring out. MacGyver was reincarnated from Bertha Benz.
She was given it real world testing as well.
Yeah, I mean, at one point, when she would run out of fuel, she would have to stop in town. Where would you find fuel for something that doesn't exist in any other place?
Yeah, what do you need fuel for? I need it for my Motorwagen outside. You're what? My Motorwagen. Okay, this lady's crazy. She's obviously off her meds. But yeah, this wasn't like there weren't gas stations at this point because nothing used gas. So what this ran on is this stuff called Man, I actually thought I wrote it down. Apparently I didn't. It's called like Lingle or something like that. It's weird.
It was a crude gasoline that was sold in apothecaries as a cleaning agent.
Yes, that's what it was. It was actually a cleaning agent that had combustible properties, which is fucking bonkers. You know it's flammable, and this is a fucking cleaning agent?
Yeah, I'm sure this had started a fire or two in the house before. But she would have to go to an apothecary, and I think it's still around today. The pharmacy boasts that it was like the first gas station in existence. It was the first one that she had stopped at and bought the fuel for the Motorwagen with. Mm-hmm. She rolls into another town, and she had to have a
Lingroin. Oh, sorry, Legroin. Legroin fuel. Yeah.
Tough name. I'm glad we went with gasoline. She rolls into another town, has to have a blacksmith fix one of the chains that drives the back wheels. At this point, it was a four-wheeler because it was the Model 3.
Yes, they had switched. They found out that four wheels in this scenario are better than three. Yeah. So they finally upgraded and added that additional wheel. Probably did wonders for the stability. You got to imagine he jumped in that thing with the fourth wheel and started riding around. Also, with the invention of the four-wheel, didn't he invent the early precursor like rack and pinion steering?
I believe it was on a later model, but it could have been right around then.
But
there's a lot of inventions that come just out of this travel.
Yeah.
Along the way, she had to use a hairpin or a hat pin. It was some sort of pin in her hair that she used to clean out one of the fuel hoses. Mm-hmm. She also used, I believe it was like a nylon or a piece of fabric to tie up a kind of like a wire harness, I think.
Either a harness or like a coolant hose that had got
I think it was a hose,
like
yeah. But when she would come up to a hill, like Chris had alluded to earlier, this didn't have another real lower gear to go into to climb up the hill. So the two boys jumped out, and they actually had some other kids that had drawn their attention to this crazy looking vehicle without horses that's traveling, and they actually would push her up the hills.
Thought she was a fucking witch, probably. Are your horses invisible or something? Ghost horses.
But she ends up making this journey. She spends 2 days there. They took another route home.
What is the other thing that she invented? Or that she came up with?
Oh, yeah. We just talked, yeah. She ended up rolling into town, and she'd gone to, it must have been like a leathersmith or something like that. Mm-hmm. And she had kind of thought, okay, hard surface, this is squealing, it's not working as effectively. If we just put a piece of leather on there as a buffer in between the wheel and the brake that would engage onto the wheel, it might slow it down better.
Might have more grip to it.
Yeah. So, what'd you say? She was...
She's credited with the invention of the modern, brake.
Yeah, the modern brake pad. That's just a...
The other thing I was thinking, because she's finding out so much about this. So in the city, you're not really going to have a lot of hills. I assume that this city's built relatively flat, so you don't really know about the thing about getting up hills. The brakes, I gotta imagine that on the flip side of the climbing of the hills, you start going downhill at some point. And when you start to build up speed in that's more than you're actually being powered, and you go to put on the brakes, those brakes are only probably tested at that point to slow something down that's traveling a maximum of 10 or 12 miles an hour that it went. If you're sitting there just laying on the brakes and because of gravity pulling that down, it's not slowing down in the same time frame. All of a sudden, those brakes are not either overheating because they're not meant for that threshold. She had to have just rolled in there and been like, there's got to be something that we can strap on this. Well, why don't we use the stuff that's on the soles of our shoes or whatever it is and try to strap that to actually slow us down a little bit easier?
Create some friction.
She comes back. Benz or Carl is like, she had notified, I think, Carl from her mother's house once she had got
Sent a telegram, yep.
Sent a telegram. So when she gets back, she's like, all right, I got notes. Sit your ass down. She's like, all right, go take a look at the brakes. I strapped some shit to them. They worked a lot better because people are going to be traveling, and if they're going uphill, that means they're going to be going downhill. Here's why we need those. The other thing, get rid of this 2-gear shit. It's not enough gears. We need a third lower gear so the boys don't have to get out and push this thing when we do actually get to a hill.
Not everybody's going to bring kids with them on their trip.
Exactly. Probably the third thing, increase the capacity of the fuel tank so I don't have to stop at every pharmacy. And fourth thing, make sure that we start calling ahead to all the pharmacies on our trips to make sure they have this LeGroin or whatever it is, so we're not running out.
Is LeGroin the German version of LaCroix?
Probably tastes similar.
But this trip was huge because nobody had thought that you could do it, or you could have a 12-hour journey and go that far, go 65 miles.
In a comfortable seat.
Yeah.
That's not being pulled by horses or anything like that. You're getting to experience something that like no one else has ever experienced at this point. You're driving an automobile. You're able to take things with you. Press, papers, all that kind of stuff, blow this thing up and basically bring this huge spotlight onto Benz.
Well, along with that, there was a raise in demand for these static internal combustion engines. It forced Benz and C to grow the factory. Their employment in 1889 was 50 employees, so they had doubled their employees. By 1899, they had 430 employees.
Yeah.
So within the next decade, they added that many more, 380 more jobs. Mm-hmm. And it just keeps growing and growing and growing. Along with that, you get to 1899, 572 units were produced. It became the largest auto company in the world in 1899. 430 people built 572 cars in 1 year. That's a lot of work.
Yeah.
It's absolutely incredible how fast that goes. First mass-produced car from 1894 to 1902 was the Benz. It was called the Velocipede. I believe they ended up just shortening it to the Velo. Mm-hmm. And that sold more than 1,200. Had a 1.5 horsepower engine and a 3 horsepower engine. Despite more than doubling the horsepower, it ended up going 12 miles an hour, 19 kilometers an hour.
And at that point, you can't even say listen to those ponies or check out those horses because it's only 1.5 horses. So you had to wait till you got to 2 to be able to say stuff like that.
Pluralize it. Participated in the first auto race in 1894 from Paris to Rouen.
Does not take any time at all. As soon as people figure out that they can actually drive around in these things, let's start fucking racing them.
Let's see who can go the fastest in them. This guy named Emile Roger ends up taking 14th place. He traveled 78 miles or 126 kilometers in 10 hours. He averaged 8 miles an hour, 12.7 kilometers an hour, which averaging that for that entire trip for 78 miles, 8 miles an hour, seems pretty good. I would say that that's pretty damn good.
Looking at that too, like think of the reliability on that.
Yeah. 1895, we get the first internal combustion engine in a bus. 1890, we go back to our old friends Daimler and Maybach.
Don't gloss over that.
Oh, yeah. I mean,
dude, you're now making it available to transport multiple people and now have the introduction into like public transportation.
I guess I never really thought about that. Did they have buses just because they were bigger that had steam-powered engines or were pulled by horses?
I don't think they were able to have, maybe they just had to have a bigger coach or something like that. But at the same time, this Fuck,
Yeah,
man.
okay. I get you. I get what you're putting down. That is a pretty big deal. To go back in time, our old friends Daimler and Maybach in 1890 had formed a company called DMG, Daimler Motoren Gesellschaft. I don't fucking know. It starts with a G. They produced their own four-stroke for the use in what Chris described earlier. That was Daimler's ultimate goal for the land, for the sea, and for the air. First DMG car model appeared in 1892 with another in 1895. Finally, 1897, DMG produced their first front engine model that had a four-seat and it was an open top. Unfortunately, they can only go on for so long. Daimler ends up dying in 1900, which kind of puts a little bit of a damper on the whole project. Maybach, though, continues undeterred. He built these things called Mercedes models, and they were based upon race car designs that he had created. And
So real quick before that, so again, like we said before, Maybach just basically fired or follows Daimler wherever he goes. If he's fired or whatever like that, Maybach leaves with him. So there was a funny story that when him and Daimler were actually using like how they had that little cottage and they'd built like the design studio
Yeah,
to like actually the neighbors thought that they were doing like counterfeiting or something because they didn't recognize any of the shit that they were working with, and they had a police raid on it when they weren't there, and they came in, they're like, there's nothing in here but engines. Like it had been something so unfamiliar to people that yeah.
it just assumed it was crime.
One thing that he also did come up with, the first engine that Daimler came up with was this thing that almost resembled like a grandfather clock, the way it was set up. I tried to visualize how the thought process even worked with this thing, like the positioning of the pistons, and I couldn't wrap my head around it. It looks so odd from what you see today, which makes sense. He created this thing called the Reitwagen, which was the first internal combustion vehicle. So he basically took this grandfather clock and just set it into the middle of a bike where the person would have to like hug the engine and wrap their arms around it in order to actually like steer the bike. I'm pretty sure he was just like, I got to get this thing on fucking wheels and have it drive for at least 10 feet just so I can be the one to claim that I did the first internal combustion engine in a vehicle. So I think that maybe that's what the reason that he did that, because the thing looked like just structurally completely unsound and completely useless.
This is a proof of concept.
Now, Daimler and Benz never actually ever met, despite them being so tied together that we're going to talk about here in just a second. The only time that they had any interaction was at a point when Daimler sued Benz over something about these like hot tubes that were part of like the sparking mechanism or something within the engine. Apparently, the tubes had been like patented or been used by Daimler, and Benz wasn't supposed to be using them, so he ended up having to like pay him royalties or usage for them. And they only met through intermediaries or communicated through intermediaries, so they never actually met, despite their names being synonymous. Well, Daimler is kind of synonymous with a lot of different vehicle manufacturers. Short explanation of that: when he started creating these motors and everything, any of these manufacturers that were maybe smaller, by tacking on his name to it, it was almost legitimizing them to be like, we're using this type of model. Kind of like how Dodge and Cummins diesel engines are. Things like that. Like you want to associate. So Daimler would sell the rights to use his name for these different companies. So you would get all these weird sounding subsidiaries like Daimler this, Daimler that. Daimler Chrysler is kind of an example of something that was just kind of in recent memory. When kind of like we alluded to before, their methods of creating their automobiles were attacked from different angles, whereas Benz basically built his as something specific to go around that engine, something that was very purpose built. Daimler, kind of like the bike thing, he was just like, go get me a 4-wheeled coach. They just stripped the thing down, and then they basically positioned the engine inside it. And that's why he essentially, his first one had 4 wheels, and why Benz had 3 wheels, because they were just simply like built in a different manner, in a different order.
Well, it's also, I think, why DMG had a little bit of the not necessarily aesthetic down more, but they produced things that looked way more like cars before Benzes started looking
They
like
look
cars.
safer.
Yeah, true. That they definitely did.
It's like remember when you were a kid and like you would, your neighbor, you'd have a four-wheeler or whatever, then be like, your parents be like, okay, just be careful. But if your neighbor had a three-wheeler, like, fuck that, no.
Man, they were so much fun.
I know they were fun, but it was like Action Park, basically.
Yeah.
You were just like, you were bound to get hurt.
Yeah, you've rolled a three-wheeler in your life, right?
Yes.
I just assume that's something
You can't
everybody's
ride
done.
a three-wheeler without rolling a three-wheeler. The first time if you're used to riding a four-wheeler and you go to turn it and you're not used to the weight distribution.
So are we to Emil yet?
Yes, please explain, because this explains so much about the name Mercedes. Because again, when this company merges, you assume it would be Daimler Benz. Mm-hmm. It's Mercedes Benz, and the way that this comes about is fucking cool.
Well, in DMG, you'd think the M would have to be for Mercedes instead of Motorin before this all happens. So enter this gentleman named Emil Jelinek, or Jelinek.
Je ne something. Je ne sais quoi.
Jelinek, I think is what it is.
There you go.
Jelinek had made his money trading in North Africa. He was a fairly well-to-do man. He ends up showing up to DMG and asks them to commission a car. There was a crash that had happened with one of the older DMG models. I think it was in a race. He asked them for a faster car and a safer car. They commissioned something called the Mercedes 35 HP, so 35 horsepower, I'm assuming.
He's asking him for race cars is basically what he's asking him to build. Now, why did they call this? How did they come with the name Mercedes?
It was his daughter's name.
Jelinek's daughter's name.
Yep.
So he basically went in there and was like, I'm going to pay you to build these race cars. I want you to name the race car series or whatever you're building after my daughter.
There was something, I want to say he had like officially changed his last name to have Mercedes
He
in
got
it.
permission to change it to his last name to Mercedes.
So he was Emil Jelinek Mercedes.
Uh-huh. I think they said it's like one of the only times in history that a father has actually taken his daughter's name as like his surname.
The weirdest shit in the world. The trademark was created for Mercedes in 1902. The 1902 Mercedes, this, out of anything that I've taken from this episode, this shit scares me the most. The Mercedes had 60, what was it? Oh, the Mercedes 60 that was built in 1902. It had a top speed of 75 miles an hour or 100 kilometers an hour. How in the world were you going 75 miles an hour in 1902 before they had really figured out flight and how fast it was? That's the fastest thing on Earth. A car was the fastest thing on Earth,
Yeah.
and it's just, it blows me away.
I have a different position that I was looking at this. First of all, how did they find out how fast it was going?
Oh,
there has to
radar
be-
gun probably wasn't a thing back then, huh?
Yeah, so it's got to be something about the time it takes to get
Yeah,
from one
distance.
distance and everything like that.
But at top speed? Like you're
Okay,
just driving in a
here's-
straight
here's the
line
other
for
thing.
75 miles?
Who did they convince to do that? To get going faster than anybody had gone before at that point. In that for like, what are they also? It's not just that it could go that fast. That also made it to where consumers could go that fast.
Yeah.
But at the same time, someone had to go in and be like, I think you can go faster. He's like, this thing starts to shake at like 40 miles an hour. And he's like, I think it'll smoothen out if you get a little bit. You're probably just hitting a rough spot.
Yeah.
You need to keep going faster. And then eventually getting up to 75 miles an hour at that point, just that'd scare you shitless. Have you ever been in an open, like on a motorcycle?
Yeah.
And been going even 35 or 40 and you feel the wind whipping against you?
Yeah, it's a scary feeling. I got to look something up, but just along those lines, DMG in 1903 had 821 employees. DMG in 1904 had 2,200 employees. So these companies are just blowing up.
It turns out it's not a fad. The automobile, actually, it turns out, is pretty popular.
I want to look this up because I got a theory now. The Nürburgring. Was this? Oh, shit.
The
no.
Nürburgring?
Huh?
Yeah, the Nürburgring.
Yeah. Yeah, no, this... Okay.
It hasn't been... I don't think it's been built yet because that's part of Ola Adolf's revitalization plan for Germany.
No?
Oh, no, that was the Autobahn.
Yeah. So it featured a Grand Prix racetrack built in 1984. the long North Leaf, whatever, North Loop track, built in the 1920s.
Oh, so
But I was thinking, is that how they figured out top speed? Was they put them on like a rudimentary Nürburgring where it was all flat and you could just drive at that consistent 75 miles an hour in a circle?
No.
Because you couldn't find a straight that was 75
I
miles
think you
long.
had to try to well, no. You wouldn't have it go 75 miles. You would clock how long it took to go a mile, and then you would extrapolate that. So, like the calculation that if you're going 60 miles an hour, you're going a mile a minute. So, if he would have got from this point to the end of the mile in 60 seconds, they would have known he was going 60 miles an hour. You can figure out the calculation on that to where if he got there in 55 seconds, you're like, okay, that's like 2.5 miles an hour. If he got there in 50 seconds, it would be something else. So if he got there in 45, it might have calculated out to like 75 miles an hour.
Kind of how you figure out between mile posts
Yes.
how fast you're going in a mile in a minute. Okay.
Yep.
Yeah, that makes way more sense. They weren't just driving 75 miles straight like that.
Well, kind of. Are we at 1909 yet?
Nope.
Okay, damn it.
By 1904, Benz and C had grown to producing and selling 3,480 automobiles. That's a lot of automobiles.
I think they had
3,000.
they had to start opening multiple factories at that point as well,
Yeah,
right?
you got to quit moving, or you got to keep moving. You got to keep expanding, just in order to have enough room to build that many. Now, 1909, give it to me, 'cause
Okay.
I think I know where you're going with it, and it's awesome.
The Blitz Benz.
Yep.
The Blitz Benz. So this guy basically designed this, and at this point, as they're designing them, they're becoming less carriage like, and they're starting to get a little lower to the ground. Wheel technology is starting to come about. I think they at this point have developed rubber tires because this Blitz Benz isn't
Maybe.
running on wood wheels or anything like that.
No, yeah, it couldn't at that.
Yeah.
no.
So again, because there's such a huge economy now around this automobile thing, you also have rubber manufacturers making tires. You have anything that these guys are trying to commission to make these vehicles more appealing. So this thing called the Blitz Benz is designed, and it's basically a racing Benz that's taken by this guy and just juiced to the gills. And this thing ends up going in 1909. This thing it has 141 horsepower.
200 horsepower.
200. Well, I think with the turbo, maybe with 141 base, and then I think it had a or a turbocharger compressor on it. Sorry, you're right. 200 horsepower, just normal. It got up to 141 miles per hour.
226 kilometers an hour. I've never gone that fast. I don't think I've ever gotten close to that fast. I might have topped out at 120 and something before, but 141 miles an hour in 1909 is unthinkable.
Plane. That's the only way you could go faster than that, like normally, like us.
I mean, at that point, I think the planes definitely weren't going that fast.
No, definitely not.
But also, at the same time, a 200 horsepower engine in 1909, when we were fooling around with 3.5 horsepower, like a couple decades ago, not even that, like a decade and a half ago, they've really figured out how to manufacture these engines in a way to where they've shrunk down the liters going through each cylinder.
Mm-hmm. Fuel economy is getting better. The way that the carburetors are working is getting better.
Unfortunately, in 1909, Benz was not really on the line working for Benz and C. Benz had created a private family company in 1906 that was called Benz and Son. It ran until 1923. They built a lot of taxis and different things. But he did remain the director at Benz and C. Carl retired as a design manager after the other directors hired a bunch of French designers because they really wanted to get into racing. And instead of asking Benz if he wanted to work with these French designers, they just went ahead and hired them. So Benz actually left the company because he didn't agree that racing, which is so funny to me because racing plays such an important part in this whole entire story of just how you get to the masses and how you advertise your product. The French designs flopped. They weren't good at all. They didn't have any success. Benz did end up staying on as director in 1903 after he had left from being the design manager. Like I say, Benz and Son, he ended up, I think he cashed out at a certain point and let his sons take over to go back to focusing on what he was doing at Benz and C. At that point, we're so close to this time that becomes very, very important for these two. Because once World War One rolls around, people aren't really looking towards cars because we're starting to try to figure out how to adopt aircrafts into the war.
We talked about this during the World War One episode that, that was the biggest thing probably between like armor. If you had to even say what was more impactful in the long run, it was definitely airplanes.
Had to be, yeah.
And so in World War One, they were used mostly for like reconnaissance, which was a huge advantage. They started putting guns on them for dogfighting. They would drop grenades and bombs, like literally just like out of their laps and like drop them down like during in like the no man's land area, like behind enemy lines. And who are you going to go to when you need to start developing these engines for the plane? You're going to go to the well-known commodities that you have right there in your country. And so both the Daimler Motor Group and then also the, Benz company developed aircraft engines during World War One. DMG also built, I believe, engines for tanks and also like the early like submarines as well.
Crazy.
Yeah.
That is so amazing to me that a car company, it makes total sense as to why you go to them because they're the best people at making engines and they've figured out how to do it. But putting a car type engine inside of a submarine just seems like a bad idea.
I think more so it was they started developing specialty engines just for that.
Could be, yeah. You still got to do something with the exhaust, so I'm assuming it would have to switch to something.
Yeah, that's when they were, I think, still in the development of like batteries, but they had that snorkel. So I think submarines in World War One were basically just kind of like underwater boats where they would have like the snorkel
10,
out
15
when they were using,
feet.
Yeah, and but they were underwater, and so they were harder to spot.
It's true. After World War One, spoiler alert, if you haven't listened to anything World War One, Germany loses. And when Germany loses, we really turn the screws on them. This bad economy forces these both companies to go in different directions. I believe DMG was making shit like sewing machines.
Yeah.
And different kind of household items like necessities that you would need. I believe Benz fell back onto its static engines just as a way to try to get through.
Trying to also like help rebuild.
Yeah. Yeah, you have to come back at some point. And you have to do it. This blew me away. We'll get to that. 1923, Benz only produces 1,382 cars. DMG only produces 1,020 cars. And that happens because the average cost was 25 million marks.
Yeah, the inflation that caused the economic
crash,
collapse in Germany, basically hyperinflation happened where they were just printing money to the point where money was valueless. So you had loaves of bread that cost 5 Reichsmarks or whatever, 5 marks 6 months ago, now costing 50,000 marks. And because of this, and also because it's a luxury item, there's still not going to be that many people that are going to go out and be like, well, I can either eat or I can buy this car. I should probably eat.
Yeah, it seems like it'd be a good idea.
And in order to survive, these companies started kind of, flirting around a little bit. They both swiped right or swiped left. I don't know. I swipe right, I think, is what the good one is.
Maybe.
Yeah. So they start having this agreement of mutual interest. It was basically a consent form, is kind of what it sounds like.
Yeah, it was the ability to basically share facilities so they didn't have to pay for all of these facilities that aren't being used now because their production is slowed so much.
And they could still operate as their separate entities and still have their different manufacturer of cars. I guess once you merged it as a company, it was to the point where it's like, now you got to collaborate on shit. Whereas this one, they were basically collaborating, saying, let's just try to build our stuff in the same places because it'll save us money.
I do think that there was a little bit of a hope, too, is like, if we don't merge with these guys, maybe they'll fall off and we can take their business away.
Yeah, exactly.
So, like, maybe it was like 2 years of like a Mexican standoff where they're staring at each other waiting for the other one to blink and fall. But, like we say, right after that happens in 1926, or right after 24 when that happens, June 28th, 1926, we get the official merger of Daimler-Benz. The 3-pointed star from Mercedes logo is used, and it is merged with the laurels, like the wreaths around the Benz logo. and that's where we get the Mercedes logo.
So the Mercedes logo being like the 3-pointed star, whatever it is,
Yeah.
that's what stands for air, land, and sea. So all the theaters that Daimler wanted to have his engines in, and they definitely were. Now they merged as Daimler Benz, but to operate as a company, Benz was like, yeah, we're not going to pay to use, because you had to pay to use the Daimler name.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, yeah, we're not going to go ahead and pay for the rights to use the Daimler name. And they were like, okay, like, well, our flagship vehicle ends up being the Mercedes because it became so popular. So they're like, why don't we name it Mercedes Benz? So that's how the name a racing enthusiast's daughter gets to have one of the, or if not the oldest auto manufacturer now named after. So props to her.
Yeah, and I don't mean to offend anybody out there when I say this, but I've heard the word or the name Mercedes more in a strip club than outside of a strip club nowadays, I think.
Well, because of this.
Yeah.
It's a name that used to mean class and sophistication. Now it just means love spell and glitter you can't get off you.
If we got any fans named Mercedes, I'm sorry. It's funny. But yeah, we have this superpower company that has shown up. And in 1927, blew me away too. Didn't realize that this happened. The diesel line launched for trucks, and its sales tripled the units to 7,918 units. That's what the diesel line did for Benz, or for Mercedes-Benz at this point.
And it's crazy to think that this entire time they're like, okay, let's look for a way that we can get this thing to operate without the refinement, the extreme refinement of the fuel and everything. Can we get this thing to run on a less refined type of fuel? And now you look at it nowadays, does it ever make sense to you that diesel costs more than regular gas?
I think it probably has something to do with there's less diesel produced than gasoline, so it's probably cheaper to refine more gasoline. Like it's more of
They're doing so much that it's actually because of the volume it becomes cheaper per unit or whatever.
I would think that would be the only reason that diesel is so ungodly expensive compared to gas usually.
Yeah. Well, they end up designing an entire line of these diesel engines to the point where it's not just, for trucks and everything. They start to actually put these diesel engines just in like regular sedans and like their coupes and everything.
Which is still lived through today.
Yeah.
I mean, there's still diesel powered cars.
That was my first time ever seeing a diesel sedan. Was like an older Benz driving by me, and you could hear the grr, 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 grr. And I
that is,
over,
huh? It was Mercedes.
Yeah, and I was like, is there some, that sounds like did he put a diesel in that? My dad's like, no, those are actually diesels. They make some cars that are like that. I was like, that fucking blew my mind. I was like, so like big trucks and semis, they can put diesel in there too?
You see yourself like looking at a gas station and it's just like 10 trucks lined up, like 10 18-wheelers lined up in the diesel line, and there's one guy in a Mercedes.
Well, and then now it's a Volkswagen.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, Volkswagen does the diesels now, huh? Mostly.
German company? Coincidence?
Yeah, I think not. April 4th, 1929, all good things must come to an end. As Daimler died in 1900, Benz ends up dying at the age of 84, which I kind of thought seemed incredible, but then when you think about like when he was born, he didn't really have success until he was kind of older. Mm-hmm. Like, it took him a while to find what he wanted to do and then be able to get to a point in his life where that's what he could focus on to do.
Yeah.
Because 1926, 84 years old, he lived a pretty long time, I think, for 1929. Not as long as Bertha, though. She ends up living till May 5th, 1944. Unfortunately, I think she saw too much of her company at the end of her life turn to bad. Excuse me. But the Depression shakes the company again. It kind of puts them in a position to where they need a little bit more help, and that help comes in not the best not from the best place.
It's wearing jack boots and it salutes a red flag.
But the Nazis come into the picture at this point, and coming into this episode, I thought that Mercedes had a pretty big hand in the Nazi organization. It turns out that the Nazi organization had a bigger hand in Mercedes.
Yeah, I think in a lot of cases, if, once we look, we've delved pretty deep into World War II, Hitler and all that stuff. We have great Hitler series. You guys should go back and listen to it if you haven't already. But it explains essentially kind of where the rise of the National Socialist Party starts. And like Adam was saying, because of the Great Depression that, in 1929 that happened, that wasn't something that just affected the United States. It affected the market, globally. Germany, that was still kind of on its back foot from World War One. What was the name of the armistice thing that they had to sign that really fucked them over?
Potsdam Agreement?
Something like that. You still had them recovering from this, paying war reparations, and now you have their economy crippled. That's kind of what, well, not kinda, that's what really helped lead to the rise of the Nazi Party, is because they came in here with all of these promises and ambitions about making the German people strong again and making them, a world power, and their economy being the best in the world. And, looking at these companies that they have within this country, when they want to start rebuilding their military after they actually get into power, they're going to look directly at the people that have been producing the most cars in their country at that point. And so kind of trying to put yourself in the position of like, and it's a slow burn too, because for us learning about it, we cover, not us, but like in school, we cover World War II and maybe the series of 2 or 3, maybe a week.
Yeah.
Everything happens so quickly that you don't really have time to realize that this whole thing in Europe especially was such a slow burn. Initially, you just have in Germany this new political party coming into power. Nothing really is, I mean, you've seen some of the crazy shit they've done because you've seen some of the rallies, kind of what they stand for, what some of their ideology is. But at the same time, they're in power. Not a whole ton is changing. They're saying they're trying to help the people. And you have these companies that are just kind of like, well, this is kind of like, what are we supposed to do? They don't know what's going on yet. It's a slow burn. The craziness doesn't get crazy right away. It ratchets itself up. So you have this new regime coming in and is like, we need you to start building, trucks and things like that to help us rebuild our military. And while you're at it, why don't you just start making airplane engines? You guys did that back in World War One. Why don't you just kind of dive back into that and see what kind of airplane engines you guys can make as well? And the reason Hitler ends up coming to Mercedes for this, there were other, companies that had to do this kind of stuff too, that got kind of co-opted and almost like puppeted.
Auto Union? Was that the other one?
I can't remember.
I think that's what it was.
So back in, I think it was 1923, after Hitler this was prior to the beer hall putsch, when he was actually arrested and sent to I'm doing quotations here, prison for a couple years. He was driving around in a different vehicle, and he saw the Mercedes, and it was this convertible, beautiful curves, and it was the epitome of like German engineering. And he's saying to himself, well, I'm trying to go ahead and endear myself to the German people. I need to be seen in, this peak of German engineering. So he ends up with Nazi Party funds. He ends up buying his first Mercedes. And I think he took a fancy in like 1923. He really liked them. Ends up going to jail for the beer hall putsch. He ends up coming out. He's written Mein Kampf. And it wasn't until 31 that he's able to actually, I think, get into one.
Yeah, part of the military aspect, obviously, you'll talk about it, and it's huge. But it can't be understated that Hitler's whole idea behind German nationalism and to build this up was they had to be the best. And surprisingly enough, shockingly enough, capitalist America had already gone ahead, and Ford was penetrating the market in Germany, which also made a lot of trouble for these German car companies, because once the United States came over, it was like, hey, these people drive cars over here too. Well, we make cars. We can probably send some over there and start selling them. Hitler wanted that power. He wanted to be able to say German engineering is the best. Wasn't wrong, I don't think.
No.
But before the war, he starts focusing on racing.
Mm-hmm.
And once he starts focusing on racing, one of the lead designers for Mercedes Benz was a gentleman named Ferdinand Porsche. And if that name sounds familiar, it is because Ferdinand Porsche was the man that created Porsche and
If you
Porsche
didn't
and
tie that
Hitler.
together.
Porsche and Hitler were pretty good friends.
I believe Porsche actually designed engines for tanks, some of the Panzers.
Ooh, Porsche engine in a tank is crazy. But he also commissioned this race team. And commissioning this race team, we get something called the Silver Arrows. Did you do research into Silver Arrows?
Yeah, so we talked about this during the F1 episode, so not to kind of like stay too far into F1 and racing and the origination of that. But the Silver Arrows were basically the vehicles, the Mercedes that they were racing were always silver. And they have this, it's basically the Mercedes Benz logo, but it's turned on its side to where it's got an arrow. It looks like the arrow is pointing forward. And they still put those on the F1 cars today. They still call them the Silver Arrows. They still put that little logo on the side of it where it's the Benz logo sideways. And it's not the circle around it. So Silver Arrows.
Tell me do you know why they're silver?
It was, what was the reason that they were silver?
The night before the first race, they had to be a certain weight.
Oh, that's right.
They were 1 kilogram over.
So they stripped the paint and just went down to the metal.
Yes. And that is why they became silver, and that's just what they stuck with.
Then they
throughout
won, and
the
they had to
entire-
stick with that.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
They absolutely crushed it. The peak of German engineering in these cars and these Silver Arrows just kicked everybody's ass in all of the races that they could. And so it brought Germany out as like okay, these guys are kind of back. They know what they're doing. Hitler was the one that kind of started to make this happen. So maybe he's got a little bit of something going there. The non-sympathizers to the Nazi party then started to be forced out, and kind of a puppet board was put into Mercedes, to the point to where it was a situation that it was almost like more the Nazi party was running Mercedes than actual Mercedes guys.
There was a like instead of a school resource officer, there was an SS officer that had his own office there that just had to make sure everything stayed up and going.
And not to say that there weren't German board members or people running the Mercedes Benz company that weren't pro-Nazi. I mean, those guys got to stick around.
Yeah.
But as far as the takeover that happens, it was purely politically driven.
Yeah. So kind of going back and correcting myself. So 1923, Hitler, again, takes a fancy to these Mercedes. He ends up getting into more of like a kind of a simple like base model and uses it to kind of travel around. They said he used it to go to all of like the smaller rallies when he was really trying to drum up support. After he gets out of jail, he has Mein Kampf out. He basically goes into the dealership and he's talking to the guy and he's like, listen, I got my royalties from my book coming in. I would love, I'm a political figure. I would love to be seen in a Benz. I love this car. And he had his eye on this one called the Model 770. Now, if you've ever seen any pictures of Hitler when he's riding in a car, he's always standing up. He's giving his little fucking Hitler salute and Nazi salute.
His lazy Nazi salute.
Yeah, the one where his horn's just gently drifting up. And it's a Benz 770. It's the car that became synonymous with Hitler. Not only with Hitler, but also with pretty much every Axis dictator. Mussolini had a 770, drove a Benz. Hirohito did. Hermann Göring, as part of Germany, did. They were popular with a lot of the scumbags in the world at the time, which I'm sure just completely thrilled the company. So in kind of toward the end of 1936, jumping back a little bit, when the Nazis were consolidating power and when they were actually in charge, Hermann Göring has this thing called the 4-year plan. And basically it's reallocating certain resources within the company and manufacturing in order to kind of help build up armaments in the military and everything like that. Doesn't really affect Mercedes. They're able to still keep manufacturing just regular, like civilian, just consumer vehicles. Well, that doesn't last very long because in 1937 they get co-opted and they have to start producing military trucks. And they produce this, like some of the model numbers and everything, like the LG 3000. If you've ever seen Indiana Jones, Raiders of the Lost Ark, the scene where he ends up having to like chase down and jump on the truck and then fight the guy on the truck and ends up getting like dragged underneath.
Yeah.
Look at the logo on the truck. It's a Mercedes. So, I mean, they're using accurate stuff. So not only are they designing, these trucks and everything, which are going to be, used for anything and everything between ferrying soldiers, equipment, things like that. They're also designing these. They're taking their consumer vehicles and turning these things into officer cars, into mobile radio units, transport vehicles. So they're co-opting all this, and the government is basically Mercedes' sole customer, taking up all of their inventory at this point. It's not cool, but from a mechanical standpoint, it's very cool. Is they designed the engines of the Messerschmitt Bf 109 fighter, which for most of World War II was like the premier fighter. For a long time, it was the best one in Europe. It started getting challenged by like the submarine Spitfire, but was still better. But not until really the introduction of like the P-51s did the Allies really have anything that could keep up with this. The engine was more advanced than the Allies had, in the sense that the Ally engines these planes were carburetor fed. And so when they would, and it's not like driving on a road. You're in 3 dimensions when you're flying. You can go upside down, you can invert and everything. When these planes would get into these like almost 0G maneuvers where they would be coming over, doing barrel rolls and pitching down, there was nothing to gravity feed into the carburetor, and these planes would end up stalling. It would only be for a few seconds, but when you lose engine power and have to crank it back up, that's all it takes for the enemy to come back around and get into firing position. These engines that were designed by Mercedes Benz were all fuel injected. So regardless of the maneuvers that these pilots were pulling off, these planes never lost power. So it gave them a huge advantage early on in the war.
Prior to the war, not to go back again, I had overlooked this. Do you know anything about the T-80 six-wheel project?
Yeah, it was the regular Benz, but it had the front wheels, but then the 2 back wheels behind it?
This is a picture of it. So Ferdinand Porsche was put in charge of this vehicle that was built, that Hitler had commissioned through him to build a car to break the land speed record. And in order to break the land speed record in 1939, I believe it had...
It looks like a damn airplane on the ground.
Yeah. The power output, 3,000 horsepower. It was a 44.5-liter engine. It was a V12. So instead of just a V6, it was just 12 cylinders lined up in the V, which is so goddamn big to think about, that they put that in a car, and they were doing it to crush this land speed record. Fortunately, because I think this might have given Hitler some more cool points, World War II does break out, and they had to scuttle the project. But just to think about a 3,000 horsepower car in
back then,
the 30s is beyond comprehension of... I mean, I don't know if it would have worked. This is all in theory because they just built it. They had never taken it out and tested it.
Had they had time to do it, they would have probably figured it out. And that's the thing, too. That's kind of the common theme with Hitler, is wanting to always try to like one up and show that Germany is the best. Same thing with the Olympics. When the Olympics got hosted and everything, wanting to go ahead and show off all of the reconstruction of Berlin and all that kind of stuff.
And then Jesse Owens fucked them up.
That's right. We get to September 1939, the official start of World War II. At this point, Germany basically just clamps down, the Nazi Party clamps down on any and all manufacturing within Germany. They're on war footing now, and they're going to be in control of everything, which, weirdly enough, for a country that their party is named the National Socialist Party, seems like a very communist way to go about it, by taking over everything and having your control over all of this private, enterprise.
Yeah, you can call yourself whatever you want.
That's true.
It doesn't mean you got to be it.
Can't argue with that.
We have the People's Republic of North Korea, or we have whatever.
A lot of oxymorons.
The People's Republic of China, all that stuff. Like it sounds good.
That's true. So at this point, once the war starts, Mercedes-Benz is pretty much forbidden to sell to any private customers or consumers. Anything that's coming off their line is going to be turned over to the government to be used for the war. So they're basically just manufacturing trucks at this point. They start manufacturing these 4x6 vehicles that are basically 2 wheels in the front and then 4 wheels in the back. They make some trucks with them
Yeah.
like that nowadays, but basically for like troop transports, all-terrain vehicles, things like that. Once Barbarossa kicks in, we kind of talked about that during the Stalingrad episode back in, was it 41 or 42 that Barbarossa started? Once that happened, any cars and trucks immediately went to the army or essential services. Immediately, without question. So pulling all of those resources into Russia, Mercedes, all of their stuff was pulled into. Pretty much halted any development of any type of just like consumer vehicles. So basically, you're sitting there in the drawing room when you used to be trying to design these beautiful curves and like fender flares and all this kind of stuff. And now you got some dude in an SS uniform behind you being like, is that you drawing a tank, right? Is that a tank that you're drawing?
Is this on company time or is this free time?
Wheels are kind of, where's the track going to go? Wheels are kind of small to be a tank. Oh, so this is going to be like a military officer's vehicle, right? Right? Okay, good.
Designing something special for Hitler.
But I mean, that completely halts any advancement for what they're going to need if they're going to even be a company, regardless of how this war ends up ending. You're not being able to advance or develop or anything like that.
Well, and it also doesn't help, too, that since you are the ones that are producing those things, the number one target for any sort of bombings that are happening are going to be at your plants.
They got hit really, really bad. I think at this point they had like 6 different plants, and a lot of them were actually destroyed by Allied bombings. Not saying, you're producing war materials. They're trying to stop the war. They absolutely should be going after those areas. Not only were they producing vehicles, but they were co-opted in some of these plants to kind of pivot from designing vehicles and manufacturing vehicles. They also had to produce ammunition in some of their plants, pistols, grenades, gun barrels, and then also airplane parts to go along with the airplane engines that they were manufacturing. Well, if you've listened to, again, the World War II episodes, you know that times start getting desperate for old Germany. And once compulsory military service got kicked in, it pretty much drew the entire workforce out of the Mercedes plants, and women were brought in to go ahead and do that, to pick up the slack, much like they were in the United States. And when that got to a point where they couldn't keep up with demand, not because they weren't capable of doing it, because demand kept increasing as output was needed as they were losing the war, they had to start bringing in foreign workers. We haven't done a Holocaust episode. I know we keep saying that and kicking it around because it's fucking hard to talk about. It's a fucking bummer. I mean, it needs to be discussed, but...
Is that why you just used the word foreign laborers?
No.
Because there's another F word that they used.
No, I know. Here's what I'm saying. When they came over and they were taking over these other countries, they first tried to bring in French workers that they were actually paying.
Yeah.
So they were like, there's work here. I'm sure it was kind of like, you need to come work here and we're going to pay. They're like, we'll come work for you. But it got to a point when they weren't able to pull those people in because guess what? France was being taken over and liberated by the Allies. So you didn't have that. You then had people that were captured on the entire Eastern Front. When we talked about Stalingrad, we talked about what they did during Barbarossa and all the atrocities. They were also taking any of the captured civilians and sending them back to Germany to work in work camps, to work in these factories because they didn't have German people working in them because they were off fighting the actual war. So you have all of these foreign workers, both ones that were paid initially, but then ones that are being forced into service.
There's that other F word.
Being forced into service. Once the foreign workers, it got to the point when, that started running a little bit low. The SS stepped in and is like, hey, we just want to know why your guys' production goals aren't kind of meeting the quotas. They're like, well, we don't really have that large of a workforce. We're trying to get this shit done. They're like, say no more. We'll get this taken care of. And basically start bringing in people that were in concentration camps and shit into here. And during the war, I think they said that the number of forced laborers that were used by Mercedes was somewhere in the neighborhood of like 60,000.
I don't know if... Was it that high? So I was going to say... 1944, almost half of the 63,610 employees were forced labor. So
it might have been over the course of the war. I'm not sure. A lot of people were forced into labor. Here's one thing that kind of caught me off guard. So trying to do the research for this, searching, Mercedes during World War II. First thing that pops up is Mercedes' website about our history. You go into the Mercedes Group website and read, and they do not fucking pull any punches on themselves. It was weird to read because I've never really seen that before. But you go through, and they just list off the things that they collaborated with and everything during the Nazi regime, the people, the forced laborers, the stuff that they made for the Nazis and everything. They use that, and they're like, this is, and they're not glorifying it, of course not. But what they're basically saying is like, this is part of the Mercedes Benz history. This is what happened to Mercedes Benz. Then they go in to discuss what they did for reparations, which didn't occur until much later. It still did occur, but it was much later. But it was just very weird to be pulling the information that you would try to be finding behind the scenes about a company, and they're just like, fuck it, people are going to find out about this. People already know about this. Let's just go ahead and address it. Let's lay it out on the table, and fuck it, people are still going to buy our shit.
Hey, if we nip it in the bud, they can't say that we tried to hide anything. If
Yeah,
we can be
exactly.
as honest and clear about this as possible, there's no way to go back.
Yeah.
I was a bit ahead of myself. The Potsdam Agreement ends up happening after the loss of World War II. And according to that, all German assets were confiscated. And Daimler-Benz,
Treaty of Versailles.
yes, that's
Treaty
right.
of Versailles.
We should have known that. Daimler-Benz loses all of its foreign assets. So any of its factories or anything like that that were either overseas or in a different country, they immediately lose those. Now, maybe the luckiest thing that happened to any car maker, I think, in Germany was Daimler-Benz ended up being in the western portion of Germany, which was much more beneficial than being in the eastern portion of
Sure,
Germany.
they may have had some factories in the eastern that maybe got shuttered. We're just
They
going to
did.
move everyone over here.
Yeah, they did. But in a not so lucky fashion, BMW happened to fall in the eastern part of Germany that was occupied by the Russians.
That would be the Russian side.
And things did not go well for BMW on that side of the coin. But new production permits were given in West Germany by the American forces that were occupying. There was production in 4 plants that had resumed in 1947 after they took them 2 years to rebuild these factories correctly.
You got to say, at least looking at it, they were like, okay, what did we not do at the end of World War I that led to us having this other World War 20 years later? Well, we kind of just left Germany and didn't rebuild or try to help them get back to a position in which they could like not resort to putting a psychopath in power to try to recover. And so even being that Germany was split up and everything, the Allies being like, okay, let's try to get these people working again, and then just everyone returned to their lives.
Get some people back on their feet, get some people back to a more capitalist society and building these things. But it worked because what they focused on was they focused on trucks, they focused on ambulances, they focused on all the necessary vehicles that were going to come along with the reconstruction of Germany. And by doing that, the 48-49 balance sheet actually showed a profit. So by 1948-49, they're already turning a profit and making money again, which is absolutely huge. We fast forward into 1952, you have to start getting your name back out there, you have to start making it happen. Throughout this whole episode, we talked about it. The easiest way to do that is get your ass in the racing circuit and start making some moves. This is where we get this guy enter a very interesting character in this play.
Is this the Deshaun Watson theory? Winning solves everything?
Yeah, a
So
little
like
bit.
in order, like, you know, if we get into these races and start winning, people are going to forget about that pesky Hitler thing.
Well, there's that, and then it's like, hey, we're still here, and we're still really
Yeah.
good at what we do. This guy named Rudolf Uhlenhaut, he was a test car engineer prior to the war, and he was half British, half German. He had spent a lot of time working for Mercedes. After the war kicks off, we're not really sure what he was doing. The SS was keeping an eye on him. I think that this might be a little bit of like, maybe we intentionally forgot what he could have been doing during the war. I'm not going to say either way. The SS obviously was watching him because he was part British, so could he be a spy, even though he's been here for forever?
Yeah.
But regardless, 1952, he pops back onto the team, and starts the racing program up again. he ends up building maybe the coolest car that I think Mercedes has ever made, like maybe coolest old school car. They got some pretty cool shit now. It's called the 300 SL race car. And this is the one that I think every kid has looked at in their life. And once you see these doors, it changes everything. So they completely went through, they rebuilt the frame and everything. And the way that they rebuilt the frame, it was going to stop the doors from traditionally swinging open. Mm-hmm. So what do? You put the hinges on the top and you create gull wing doors.
Yeah.
This was the first car ever with gull wing doors. When they looked at the way the doors were configured and they saw them open, they're like, oh shit, that looks like a seagull, gull wing doors. Mm-hmm. That's how we get it. It's probably one of the best things that I've ever seen done to a car just because it looks so different from anything else.
It reminds me of it looks like a 61, 62 Corvette.
Yeah.
Had sex with like the original Aston Martin, like the James Bond, like the DB. That's exactly what it looks like, and it is sexy.
Which would make sense because I think between Aston Martin and Jesus Christ, Alfa Romeo,
yeah,
those are probably my two favorite car makers. Just the things that they produce are some of just the sexiest things ever. Mm-hmm. I can remember watching. You've seen the show My Strange Addiction.
Yes.
There was an episode where this guy fell in love with his car, and he had it was like a Toyota something or other.
Like a Corolla?
Yeah, it was a little fancier than that, but it was not great.
It was a Camry.
And I didn't really understand it. And then I think the first time I saw an Aston Martin DB8, I was like, I get it.
I guess it's some similarities because there's different classes of woman. And
yeah.
Yeah.
Yep. It's just, they're so...
The Corolla is who you're looking at when the lights come on at 2 a.m. for last call and everything like that. Yeah.
That's exactly it. But Rudolf Uhlenhaut was kind of a wunderkind when it came to racing because not only did he create this 300 SL race car, it won the 24-hour race at Le Mans. And during test times when they were testing out another car that they had called the Benz W196R that won F1 championships in 1954 and 55. It was driven by a guy named Juan Manuel Fangio. And this guy was winning F1 championships. When they were doing test times, Uhlenhaut actually had better test times than the guy that was winning the F1 championships. That was how good of a driver this guy was. Yeah. And how well he knew the cars that he created that he could do it that way. By 1950, Daimler-Benz almost held like a monopoly on manufacturing diesel engines. If you were going to put a diesel engine in anything, it was going to go through Benz.
That's one thing, too, here in the States is we're just kind of finding that out now with like all of like the Mercedes vans being converted to like travel vans and everything. And also about like all of the like Mercedes trucks getting brought over. I didn't even know that Mercedes manufactured trucks and everything like that for the longest time until I started seeing that kind of stuff pop up.
Like semis and lorries, 18-wheelers.
Yeah, and then you look at it and you're like, oh, yeah, this shit's been going on in Europe since fucking they've been around.
Yeah. They've really been able to get this going.
Did you also think, not to kind of go back, but did you used to think that the Model T was like the first automobile? I thought about that. I thought it got so built up by Ford and everything like that it felt like maybe that's something that's kind of like pushed here in the States.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Because, I mean, it took us doing this episode to know that Mercedes kind of created the first car.
Yeah.
Or I guess definitely did. This blows my mind. By 1955, so 10 years after the war, 47 is when all their plants were fully functional after this. By 1955, Daimler-Benz had 178 general distributors worldwide. That's a pretty big rebound to send those guys back out. Again, motorsport success basically puts Mercedes-Benz back on the map because as they're winning all of these F1 races and they're winning the Grand Prix, they're winning Le Mans, all that kind of stuff that's going on, it just gives them a platform. You're getting free advertising by winning these things, basically.
Do you think part of like kind of the bounce back and the success that they had, because you got to figure, I'm trying to think how long we were in West Germany. And I'm wondering if
86.
Okay, so
was that? It was when Gorbachev tore down the wall.
Yeah, Mr. Gorbachev tear down that wall.
Oh no, that would have been. Yeah, that might have been the 80s.
80s, yeah. Whenever David Hasselhoff was big, Germans love him.
That's your time reference.
Yeah. Do you think that with, the Allies trying to get this portion of Germany back up to speed and self-sufficient, that part of that distribution was probably helped out by the fact that, like, there was so much availability of, like, shipping and transport and everything all over the world due to the Allies trying to help out? Because you got to imagine that while we're being in there, it's not just benevolency and wanting to start another war, but we're in there looking at, like, what can we make money on? And all of a sudden we see this auto manufacturer that's just cranking out all these hits. And it's like, we could probably start shipping their stuff off to different portions of the world and maybe try to get a little piece of this in one way or another. So you got to imagine that, like, for them to be able to have that kind of distribution within 10 years just after the war while they're still recovering, you got to think that there's probably a little help with the allies of the United States being like, you want to kind of,
Well, I'm sure there was a little bit like, hey, when we were fighting you guys and we ended up beating your ass in World War II, we created all of these new routes of travel to get all of the military supplies and all the soldiers and everything in this way. If you guys maybe want to use those same pathways that we had taken to just start distributing your stuff, we actually got into your country from X country, X country, and X country. Just go ahead and follow our routes back there.
Yeah, and if you want to go ahead and send us some Mercedes over to the States, maybe park them in our garages, things like that, yeah, we can definitely make that happen.
Well, to go along with that, kind of in counter to it, there were certain countries that had created laws and regulations as to your cars being sold in our countries would have to be made in our countries. We're not letting you just import in and make a ton of money.
Idea.
We want a little piece of the pie too. Daimler Benz had established production plants in Iran, South Africa, Turkey, Argentina, Brazil, and India. So that's truly a worldwide stretch that they're going with just production plants.
Two ways you can take that. You can take it as the way of being like, okay, we're going to open up jobs in your company and everything. At the same time, do you think they're looking at that saying, what's the average wage for the people in these countries?
Oh, yeah. Yep, okay.
It's much lower than ours. Okay, yes, we will definitely build a factory. While we're at it, not only will we just be building the factory for the cars that are selling in your country, we're going to be building enough cars that we can then send them to other countries as well.
From your country, all the other countries over there. It's just going to cut our shipping time down, basically. Yeah. Surprisingly, I didn't realize that this was such an old invention. 1959, the company started to develop crumple zones to increase safety for passenger vehicles. So having areas of the car that if you are in a collision, it just crumples in and takes a lot of the weight of the hit, so it doesn't impact the passengers as much. Also, with crumple zones, you have the ability to start, like, replacing fenders and things like that.
Instead of the entire structure of the vehicle.
Yeah, so pretty good to happen back in 1959. To the 60s and 70s, and we're speeding through this because the meat of it was kind of before, but I find all this stuff really fascinating, just how they grew. Through the 60s and 70s, Daimler-Benz was the European leader in trucks, buses, and higher-end vehicles. So you start to see the shift back. We have the market now. We're doing well with all of our utilitarian vehicles. We can start focusing back on adding the luxury in Mercedes.
Yeah.
And we can start targeting the market.
We got our pipeline for our money and everything. Let's start having some fun.
Yep. We can start making some very nice cars for some very rich people and start to sell to them. And through that, there was a company that came out. We'll just go over this kind of quick because I find it really interesting too. AMG. AMG was founded in 1967, and they were founded as something called a tuning house. Now, a tuning house nowadays, I don't know if there's a lot of them left because a lot of them have been absorbed. Like Shelby was technically a tuning house that got pulled back into Ford from Carroll Shelby.
Yep.
There was something called a Saleen Mustang that they also used to make, and Saleen was kind of the aftermarket tuning house that would go through and
I think they have like
beef up the engine.
Roush is a tuning house or something like that.
Along those lines, yeah. So these two guys that started AMG were two Mercedes Benz engineers, a guy named Hans Alfric and a guy named Erhard Melcher. Alfric and Melcher had both been working with Mercedes, and going through their racing time, they kind of had different improvements that they were making to engines. They weren't racing as much during this point, but these two guys were kind of working on some things in their spare time. And once they kind of patented this AMG engine, early AMG engine, because it was designed by those two, they brought it back to Mercedes. Like, hey, throw these in the race cars. They're badass. We supercharge these things. They're going to be sweet. Throw them in the racing cars, everything goes very well, but they're still not really sold on racing again. So, Alfred and Melcher end up leaving. They form AMG, which is Alfred Melcher Grossbach. It was Alfred's hometown, I guess was the name of it. They continued working closely with Mercedes Benz racing program, providing different things for them. But during their time apart, they also started working a little bit with McLaren. They've done some things with Mitsubishi, Chrysler, all that kind of stuff. In 1959, Daimler actually comes back and purchases the controlling interest in AMG. So they bring them back into the fold. That's why in the early...
1999?
Yeah.
Okay.
So in the early time, I guess you'd say the early 2000s, you start to see the AMG badges showing back up on Mercedes because
like
it wasn't
the souped up sports cars,
Yeah.
like the highest of the high paddle shifters, just like stuff you shouldn't be stuff they shouldn't be handing the keys to regular people that can afford them.
Yep. But this whole idea was AMG had gotten so big on their time apart that somebody would go out and buy a Mercedes and they would take it straight to AMG so AMG could bore out the heads in the engine. Mm-hmm. They could super fine tune everything. Eventually, when they just blew the doors off as far as mechanically, people started looking at them like, well, what about body parts? Can you guys create like flared fenders? Can you put a ground effects kit on this? Is there any spoiler that you guys would recommend to put on it? So AMG started completely custom fitting these Mercedes. And Mercedes like, well, shit, you guys are probably making a lot of money off of our stuff just by improving it. Why don't we just go ahead and buy
What
your
can you start
controlling
putting on our
interest?
production models? How can we do your guys' niche stuff in a full production capacity?
So it all comes full circle that these two engineers started out on their own, created a product based upon what they knew, and ended up being bought back out. Along with that, 1998, Daimler and Chrysler merged. The merger was valued at $35 to $38 billion. Mercedes, up to this point in time, has been kind of a leader in development of any sort of alternate power beyond internal combustion engines. They're in a little bit of everything. Kind of something that I didn't know about that's pretty amazing. There's something called the Mercedes Benz GH2 lorry. It completed 621 miles or 1,000 kilometers on a single tank of hydrogen.
Fuck yeah.
That's pretty fucking far.
Yeah.
Especially for a truck, a long haul truck.
Well, and think of it this way. Europe is more compact. 621 miles in Europe gets you a lot more places than it does in the States and everything, where stuff is a lot more spread out. So that's huge. One thing too, just to kind of provide some, differentiation. So Daimler and Chrysler did go ahead and merge in 1998. That doesn't mean that Mercedes merged with Chrysler or anything like that, because again, dating back to when Daimler was able to go ahead and sell the rights to his name in that association, there were still other associations of like the Daimler Corporation that was separate, which is why it's called Mercedes Benz. And then you also have Daimler that's also kind of its own thing as well, but they're still kind of intertwined.
They're still kind of strange bedfellows at this point. But like I said, that lorry was just a concept. It was something that they built to kind of see if they could do it. There's things going into production now as far as trying to figure out hydrogen fuel cells, electric.
Do you think the fear about that is the explosion?
Gotta be.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the only reason. Besides, maybe it could be a little tough to like store at a gas station or anything like that, because that's also an explosion risk too. But I mean, I think there could be something to it. I don't know. I hope there is something to it, because it's cool to be at a time when we're kind of forced into maybe trying to start looking for these things to try to get off of fossil fuels. At the same time, there's also like the scary nature of hoping that we can figure something out fairly soon.
That doesn't have the potential to easily kill us.
Yep.
And I mean, and during this time, Mercedes has kind of dipped its foot in and out of racing. They've been more prominent in it than they have been out of it. But, if you pay any attention to Formula One, there was a stretch there within the last, I think, probably not within the last 3 years, because they've been kind of on a downturn, but the 7 or 8 years before that, the entire sport was dominated by Lewis Hamilton and Mercedes, both winning the driver championships and the constructors' cups like record amounts. And so within these companies that are designing all of these consumer vehicles, you have these specialized departments like AMG, but then ones that are completely separate as well, that are building from the ground up manufacturing every single part for these just epitomes of peak mechanical engineering that are these F1 cars.
Well,
so, I mean,
they're also selling engines to other teams, aren't they?
yes.
So it's not just their own team that they're working for. They're working to sell to these other teams as well because they want them because they're that great.
Yeah.
And along with Lewis Hamilton, you have Michael Schumacher, the best F1 racer of all time.
There's been the thing about drivers is they all tend to kind of like have contracts that are up. So
free agents, yeah.
Yeah, so Schumacher's driven for Ferrari, so he might be even more well-known for Ferrari, but Hamilton's also driven for McLaren, and next year he's going to drive for Ferrari because that's, I guess, the thing that drivers, they want to always at least at one point drive for Ferrari just because of the status of it and everything. But
it's like wanting to play in New York.
Exactly. Yep.
But, yeah, I mean, it's to know that Schumacher, even though he might not have spent as much time with them, he drove for Mercedes, and you have Lewis Hamilton that drove for Mercedes. Lewis Hamilton's second driver was actually pretty good too, wasn't he?
Yeah, during that time. That's why they won so many constructors championships.
He just traded back and forth.
The guy would, if Hamilton wasn't winning, the other guy had a really good chance to win. His name was Valtteri Bottas, but. Yeah, I mean, he was a great driver in his own right. He had the misfortune of going against, at the time, the best driver in the world.
He was playing against Jordan.
Yeah, exactly. He was Pippin against Jordan, and they weren't going to win in practice, yeah.
But as of August 2024, Mercedes Benz has a market cap of $67.5 billion. That's a lot of money.
A lot of money.
It's just incredible. After doing this episode, I did jump on the old stock market trader and look and see what Mercedes was trading at and see if there was any way to maybe
get it on there.
Yeah, maybe get it on the action. But all in all, I mean, Mercedes-Benz is a fascinating company. We jumped into this looking for something very interesting in the auto realm because we haven't really touched it yet, and thought we found Mercedes-Benz that would have this just fun history that changes, during World War II and all that, and everything that they had been a part of. And you still have other companies like Porsche that were very involved with the Nazi regime. But we stumbled into Carl Benz. And the Carl Benz story of this whole thing, nothing would be here without Carl.
Yeah.
So just so cool to start at one place and just get taken all the way to the origin of the motor vehicle.
Yeah. That sums it up. I can't add on to that.
This one was a lot of fun. Like I say, if you guys are car guys out there, I hope we did this justice.
Yeah.
This, again, our first dip into the automotive world, and hopefully it went well. I feel like it went pretty well.
All right, guys. Well, thanks for tuning in this week, and we'll catch you on the next one.
Peace.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, thanks for joining us for another episode. If you like what you heard, hit that subscribe and like button. Follow us. If you didn't like what you heard, still hit that anyway, because we'll probably cover something in the future that you do like. Please follow us on our social media. Adam, hit them with it.
Our Instagram is Historically High Pod, Historically High POD, and we are on Twitter at Historically High. That's Historically HI.
All right. And if you guys want to send in any feedback, suggestions, hit us up on those two, or you can even do it on Gmail. It's historicallyhighpodcast@gmail.com. Thanks again.
Peace.